Hi, this is David White from Sportsman's Emporium, and today I'm going to talk about fly line selection and what all these little letters and numbers mean on the outside of fly line boxes, to beginners and folks who don't really know. Basically, the most common fly line is called a weight forward floating line. And when you look at fly lines, they're basically a three-part sequence of letters and numbers. They're always going to start with the weight forward's always going to have a WF, which means weight forward, and then it's going to have a dash, and it's going to have the line size. This is a 4-weight fly line, so it's going to have a 4, and then it has another dash and another letter. And that letter on this one is F, and that stands for floating line. So this whole fly line floats, and it's a weight forward fly line in a 4-weight. What weight forward means is when you have your fly line, it's tapered in different thicknesses throughout the fly line. In general, the first about roughly 40 feet of the fly line has a taper to it, and then it tapers down into one consistent taper that goes all the way back the full 90 feet of the line, and they call that the running line. And that's really just what goes around your reel, and if you hook a fish, that's what it's running with if it's pulling your line out. The first 40 feet or so are really the most important, and that's where the weight is. And on a weight forward line, that line will taper, and it'll start about 40 feet back on the fly line and taper into a little bit thicker of almost like a baseball bat consistency. And that taper and that weight forward helps you cast your fly line, and it carries it through a lot better, especially if you're casting pretty far. So really, that a weight forward 4-weight floating line is really a good all-around fly line for this area. If you're just starting out, I would recommend just sticking with a weight forward floating line. In general, you're probably going to use a 4 or 5 weight, but in general, the weight forward floating is a good one to start with, and that'll get you through most situations. Now, there's another line that you might run into, and it's called a double taper. And if you see this that says DT2F, that basically stands for double taper 2-weight floating line. And this floats, but what the double taper is there's no weight forward to it. You know, there's the same taper on both sides of the line with about a 32-foot section in between, and then the other 32 or so feet taper out the opposite direction. They don't get weight forward. Basically, they get a little bit smaller is what happens. Well, the reason for that is in a lot of times if you're casting on small streams, especially the really small West Virginia native streams, you don't really need a big heavy weight forward line to carry your fly out when you're just casting really short and doing roll casting. Double tapered lines are really good for roll casting, in a lot of ways better than a float and then a weight forward line. If you're doing your forward casting and you're double hauling, a weight forward line performs a little better. But if you're really just a brook trout guy or gal and chasing trout on the really small streams where you're not doing a lot of overhead casting and you're not casting really far, then a double tapered line is fine. There's one other advantage to a double taper that is worth consideration, and that is that since both ends are tapered the same, when you scuff up and wear out the front part of your line, instead of needing a new line, you can flip it over and wear out the other side before you discard it. And that is really just a way to make a pretty expensive fly line last longer. And that is one advantage to a double taper. So if I were the type of fly fisherman who really just fished the tiny streams and chased trout on small streams and brookies, a double taper would be my line of choice for sure. Now, you know, if you're getting into warm water fly fishing or throwing streamers to trout, what'll happen is you're going to eventually run across sinking and sink tip fly lines. And this is a little different sequence of numbers, and I'm going to try to make sense of it for you. This one here says WF7S3. And that's even a little more confusing than the standard weight forward. But basically it's got weight forward, so we know that WF stands for that. The 7 still stands for the weight of the line. This is a 7-weight line. Now the S basically means that it's a sinking line, and instead of a floating line, which would be F. But that little 3, where that comes into play, is basically how fast it's designed to sink. There's in general 3 different ranges of sink. There's a really slow or intermediate sink, which basically it sinks real slow. A lot of times it'll just get your fly just under the surface, and it'll sink at a rate of maybe 1 inch per second. The 3 sinking line is the in between. The 6 is the super fast sink rate, and the 3 is kind of the in between. It's supposed to sink about 3 inches per second, and that's really what that stands for. And you can imagine that the 6 sinking rate would sink 6 inches per second. That's what they say. There is a difference in casting these lines though, and that's something that if you're getting into throwing streamers and warm water fly fishing and you try out a sinking line, I would recommend probably staying with the slower sink rate first, because they're much easier to handle and cast. But basically, to select your fly line and to make sense of all these numbers, these are the 3 lines you're going to run into out there on store shelves. And when you're really confused, hopefully this video will help make sense of it, because I know that's a common thing with beginners. They're not really sure what this means until someone explains it. So in general, most fly fishermen, if you're just going to fish for trout, a weight forward or floating line is really good. If you're a small stream fly fisherman, you're chasing brookies on little streams, you're not casting far, a double taper line is probably the right line. And again, it can be flipped over and used twice as long as most lines. And if you're going to throw streamers and you need to get your bait fish patterns under the surface of the water and down lower to where the fish are, look for the weight forward sinking line.